Hello, good afternoon, everyone. It's so wonderful to be in community with all of you. Can we I just want to offer a moment of gratitude to our colleagues in career services for an amazing suite of offerings so that we can better continue to better understand how we can organize as a community in service of all of our students and their career development. So colleagues, thank you all so much for creating this space, learning and loving community for all of us. I'm really excited to participate as a moderator of this panel of awesomeness as we talk about our own perspectives on career success. And so with that, because we have a rich collective of colleagues, what I'm going to do is I'm going to launch with the first set of questions. And since I have specific questions for each of our colleagues, when each of our colleagues answers the question, they'll begin with introducing themselves first. Joseph has put in the chat function the bios of all of our colleagues, so feel free to take a look at that. So with that, let's get started. I'm really, really excited again. And the first question that I have is for Tamara Greenfield King. Tamara, the question that we have for you is, from your perspective and lens, how can we help students widen their definition of career success and think broadly about career opportunities?
Thank you, Mamta. I will just briefly say good afternoon, Tamara Greenfield King, currently serving as the Senior Associate Vice Provost over in University Life. Delighted to be here and a part of this panel. So I love this question because I can go back to my own journey. For many folks, I represent someone who knew they were going to college my entire life. It was an expectation from my family. I would be the first generation to actually obtain a four-year college degree. And in that regard, I knew I was going to college. When I got to college, I was a fish out of water. And at that time, in the early 80s, that's yes, how old I am. In the early 80s, success was defined by how much money you were going to make when you graduated. And the more money you made, quote unquote, the more successful you were. I then went to law school, even though I never had intentions to ever practice law. I went for the educational experience. So then I go to law school. I'm in law school. Unbeknownst to me, law school is going to train you to be a lawyer. So I go to law school. I do what everyone else does. I trained to be a lawyer. And for 11 years, I practiced law in a very traditional litigation series of firms. And one day I was like, I'm not happy. I know everybody loves to say, I'm a doctor, I'm a lawyer, I'm an engineer, I'm an architect, I'm an accountant, because those feel like successful phrases and professions. At the same time, I felt like I wasn't doing enough for returning back to the community that had provided to me. So then I went on and transitioned at a time when I was making some life choices, getting married, moving to another region of the country. And that's when I said, this is my probably opportunity to pivot to something that I really want to do. And I went into higher education. So I define my higher education as successful. It was never in my cards when I was 20 in the career center at my alma mater. And quite frankly, I think when I work with students, I often tell them that story because people say, well, if you go to law school, clearly you want to be a lawyer. If you go to medical school, clearly you want to be a doctor. And that's just not actually true. Great skill set to have. I always tell students going to law school allowed me to have instant credibility in any space that I walked into professionally and in my community engagement. So for Penn students specifically, I think it's so helpful to get them to see not 22, 25, 28, but where do they want to be at 40, at 60. That's where it matters how successful you are. I am proud to say I get up every morning and I do not dread going to work. So I feel like I'm successful because I love my job. I love what I do. I get up every morning. I'm not miserable. I get to interact with some of the most amazing people in the world. And for that, that defines me as successful. So I really try to steer students to say, figure out what your passion is. Yes, you need an education in some regards, but don't let the traditional definition of success, how much money do you make, define success, because money does not make you happy. I know many of us may think it does, but for the students, that may not still bring them happiness. And I just think our students nowadays have the world at their fingertips, and they can see things that we didn't see maybe when we were in college, but there's no end to it. Thank you.
Thank you, Tamara. And you bring up a powerful kind of juxtaposition of, how do we define success, and that success is personal, that it may not be primarily linked to income, and yet income is an important component, right? So it only makes good sense to ask the next question to Mark Lowe. Mark, just a reminder, if you can also introduce yourself before answering the question. But as we do think about, more access into higher education and the role of higher education in transforming people's lives, what are things that you want us and the rest of our colleagues here to keep in mind when we're thinking about first generation and lower income students and their career pathways? What guidance would you offer us?
Thanks, Mamta. Hi, folks. I'm Mark Lowe, Executive Director of Penn First Plus. I want to thank Tamara for her narrative, because it sets the stage for some points that I'm going to hammer home in response to Mamta's question. I want to start by acknowledging the privileged space that we are in and having this conversation, because the career outcomes for Penn students are phenomenal. Part of that is what we call credential signaling as a byproduct of coming from a place like Penn, which is an earned privilege for our first generation and lower income students. But what I want to I want to take a step back for a minute and talk about a problematic remark I heard in the audience at another institution that over the course of a decade had catapulted itself from a tier 3 institution to one of the top 50 schools in the country. I was watching this panel, and someone who had worked there for a period of time had the audacity to say that students no longer go to that institution and become hairdressers. I want to sit in that for a second, because this institution was also located in a working class community, and that particular statement is loaded with classism and assumptions about the goals that students who are going to that institution hold. And it also touches on something that has been centered in the narrative around higher education for about 3 decades, if not a little bit more now. And that's that modern society makes the assumption that a 4-year degree should lead to socioeconomic mobility for those that pursue it. And that's particularly problematic for first generation and lower income students, because how we conceive of what economic mobility looks like, it is rooted in our own positionality and our own journeys in terms of what is more for me and for my community. And that's not universal across the board. So I want to start off by naming that. And that's my core advice for folks in listening to this conversation is that economic mobility, socioeconomic mobility should not be centered as a goal, nor the goal for our FIGLY students. Tying our assumptions about these students and their aspirations to their future income limits their possibilities and reifies classist notions of what constitutes a career pathway of merit to their education, to their intellect, their community, and their value, as well as the value of their education to a larger society. FIGLY students inherently deserve the opportunity to explore their intellectual passions in ways that align with their individual values and those of their home communities. In the near term, that might mean that they earn a little bit less than peers that pursue careers in high-paying fields. But when you look at the research, the true externalities and the additional benefits of a four-year degree are more about informing how they navigate the world, understand that world, and cultivate a meaningful quality of life therein. And these are actually the privileges that wealthier students tend to take for granted, that sort of freedom. And that if we're truly invested in equity and social justice, we should be promoting those same experiences and outcomes for our FIGLY students. And what we also know when you look at the research is that there are declining returns on the benefits of income the higher you go. There is more stress, there are more obligations, there are more expectations. And so we do a disservice to our students, all of our students, not just our FIGLY students, every time we yield to the pressure that we witness in mainstream society, and especially at Penn. I want to name this as a particularly intense Penn phenomenon, that students should be expected to land internships and job offers at a certain time frame in their career and at a certain pay level. So what I want to center is encouraging our students to spend their first year and a half exploring their academic talents and interests. And they'll be in a much better place to identify and land their first substantive professional opportunity. We can acknowledge their employment anxieties and work with them on how to focus on their epistemological and ontological growth that will serve their careers long term. I want to start to wrap up by acknowledging another problematic thing I encountered in my career. I worked at MIT for a period of time, and there was this saying in student culture that MIT students go to work for Harvard grads. Now I'm going to unpack that a little bit and some of the things that were undergirding that statement, and that the reality is that that's not true. But students who don't cultivate the habits of mind intrinsic to liberal education are not oriented to long-term growth, and therefore don't necessarily stand the equivalent chance at that professional growth beyond their early career. And for our colleagues who are struggling with just some dissidence about these points, I also want to remind you of something else that the college impact literature states. Most of the economic returns from higher education come from two-year degrees. Let's be clear, most of the economic gains from higher education come out of community colleges, whereas every year thereafter has other benefits in terms of critical thinking, reasoning, leadership development. And those are the outcomes that students who are pursuing a four-year degree need to be centering in their experience here. And so I'm sorry for rambling a little bit. Thanks so much for your patience, Mamta.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I appreciate your challenging of certainly all of our thinking. I want to speak from my frame, my own thinking, especially, coming from a lower income background myself, right? We think about the narratives that we've internalized and how really a four-year experience is a pathway when our students are mentored well to freedom, and that freedom comes with that exploration, to have that exploration that students of other different backgrounds have kind of mentioned. And quite interestingly enough, you also lead us into our next panelist in quite poetic ways. When you talk about our students' onto-epistemological frames and really centering our students' truths, right? Centering our students' ways of knowing and being and meaning making. Many of our students come from different ways of knowing, being, and meaning making, and we may not know what those frames are and how strongly our different cultural contexts influence those frames, right? And so my next question goes to Rudy. Rudy, as we think about the diversity of our student populations, and in this case specifically our international student populations, what challenges do you see international students facing that can impact their process and their competitiveness and their career pathways? What are some proactive steps, either macro or micro proactive steps that we can use to dismantle or combat some of these challenges?
Thank you, Mamta, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Rudy Altamirano. I'm the Director of the International Student Scholar Services and the Director of Immigration and Integration Services. That's a very, very good question, Mamta, because it's very encompassing and very holistic, and there's so many facets that are involved. So I will try to dissect them in so many different ways. Right now, the international education sector is undergoing the stress of the global health crisis, as we all know, the pandemic. and it will likely take years to recoup the fall in international enrollments, which is very prominent right now, which is also including associated financial losses. Some schools, some institutions are likely to be closed on a permanent basis. And so as universities, as Penn, we need to be creative and innovative to survive and to maintain the provision of high quality education programs for international students. The United States, for example, has recently been losing its market share of international students, which has a knock-on effect on our profile with this diminishing number, for example, of alumni, the suffering in reduction in economic contribution of its smaller international graduate talent pool. So there's a recent study, in fact, 2021 of Israel and Batalova from the Migration Policy Institute, and they discovered that it's not employability that is the deciding factor in the success or failure of international students. It's more of barriers to work visas. There's a sentiment against the recruitment of foreign workers, for example, which was fueled by the last administration. When you say the Buy American and Hire American executive order of 2017, I'm glad we're out of that challenge. However, the policy designed to increase the visa hurdles for both international students and foreign workers in the US have continued to dampen the appeal and opportunity to study abroad here in the United States. Employers, for example, are very reluctant to hire international graduates still, even pre-COVID with temporary work visas, if they had other candidates who were permanent residents or US citizens, for example. And these worries were intensified in the summer of 2020 when new US immigration guidance were intensified and were introduced when they are being asked to study online and the challenge of studying online. So this COVID-19 has really exacerbated the declines in our international student enrollment. And of course, it's creating more challenges for international students. Penn will be doing an in-person component this semester. But again, we're not out of the woods yet. I'm sure we are hearing from a lot of Indian students who are saying, how can we be integrated to the university campus when we cannot even survive COVID and we cannot even get a visa? And so it's very important for us to know that the total number of new international students fall by 43% in the last year because some chose to defer their studies, and the worsening of the pandemic has really created more challenges for them. So what are the proactive steps that you asked, Mamta? I will really divide it into a macro and then we go macro. I'm very optimistic with the Biden administration that the new administration signals a sea change in government policy and legislation, which can offer some respite to this beleaguered higher education sector. But I think it will take time for perceptions to change and competitor nations who have shown a more friendly face in recent years. So we're competing with Australia, New Zealand, Europe, and even Asia. They're now working so hard to attract students who have been put off by recent insular policies. So for us to survive this in terms of the career pathways, we need appropriate federal policies that can reverse the downward trend, making the visas, the F1 visas, more of a dual intent, providing a clear path for STEM degrees from US institutions. A shift in the US administration will also be very important by increasing the availability of highly skilled visas, exempting PhD graduate students in STEM fields from employment-based visa caps, reducing the visa backlogs, speeding up visa and citizenship application. Those are some examples. For me, in the micro level also, as the University of Pennsylvania, I would like to encourage not just Penn, but other universities in proactively engaging and providing support for the possession of an array of so-called soft skills for our international students. I am very fortunate, Mamta, that I'm working with your leadership, and Barbara has been a wonderful colleague and partner for ISS, for example, in making sure that this is achieved. But studies have shown that soft skills including character traits, attitude, behaviors are very important for international students. Ability to cooperate with others, be flexible, showing enthusiasm, reliability, commitment. Those kind of things are very important. Another thing that studies have shown that is very important right now is the development of intercultural competency and intercultural teamwork skills for our international students. They don't realize that, applications, job applications is not a one-time preparation, but it should be a lifelong process. So for our prospective employers, these professional skills are a measure of individuals' employability. And third, for us, I think we need a coordinated recruitment strategy among associations. And so for us, we need to work with each other, not just within the university, but others, for example, working with AAU, NAFSA, and other university institutions to make sure that we are providing support to our international students and allowing them to express interest in being part of a university and a global environment. And so those are some of the things that I would like to mention. Again, being marketable, having a very unified recruitment strategy, and making sure that in the macro level that with the Biden administration, hopefully we will see the light at the end of the tunnel.
Thank you so much, Rudy. I'm really moved by the interesting thread that goes between what Tamara, Mark, and you have referenced at some level related to the four-year degree experience. And while there is the academic major, you all have talked about the critical thinking skills, which do intersect with soft skills, which then prepare you for that liberal education concept and component. So that the mentorship and support needed to be able to explore, to be able to kind of apply those skills towards a greater good, just seems to be a recurrent theme. So as I want to shift a little bit, and sometimes when we speak, I am sometimes I do this. When I speak in my lens, I think in an undergrad-based lens sometimes, and I have, I'm grateful to be back on a college campus that is rich with graduate, undergraduate, and professional students with just a broad array of learning, research, and exploration going forward. And so my next question, Steve DiNardo, this is for you. What challenges do you frequently see in the realm of graduate students, and particularly in those research focused areas, for example, in biomedical studies and things like that?
Yep. Hi, everybody. So am I good? Am I on? Yep. I'm Steve DiNardo, and I'm the Director of Training Support and Career sort of planning for biomedical graduate studies. So you'll hear in a little bit from Meredith, who'll talk about, I think, part of graduate education and other disciplines and areas here. So we're biomedically focused in research, and the community we serve is probably 600 to 700 students marching towards their PhD or MD, PhD, combined degree in some cases. And so there's two things maybe that I'll talk about. One is how to deal with actually students wrestling with their current career choice, which is now they're here in graduate school. So what does that really mean? Because that's interesting. And then the second is they realize that they have to have some trajectory going forward. So that's the future career choice. So the current career choice was something I didn't completely appreciate until I took this position within biomedical graduate studies. And that is that often, but not always, they're coming out of a university college situation, and they need to make a shift. And that shift is with regard to how they're going to be evaluated. It's not really about grades. It's not so much about tests. There are those things, but it's really about something else, especially in the research sciences, which is very heavily cutting edge, and we don't have answers, and there are not going to be definitive statements made. And that psychological difference takes different of the population different times to come to terms with. And I don't have any idea of whether different communities within the BGS students approach that differently or actually reach that differently. So I have no information about whether certain communities that we serve within our BGS population do that less well or better than others. And I'd be interested in other people's opinions about that. But that is a thing that they have to deal with. And the other thing, the second thing that I want to talk about is what they then have to adjust to, like what they're going to do next. And that has a bearing on the first thing. And that is that they get so deep in their research, incredibly so, and they're creative and excellent, and they do wonderful stuff, but they're very focused with not blinders, that'd be unfair to the talent of the students, but really they have to go down deep. And so because of that, it's hard for them to recognize that one of the things about a PhD is that they are incredibly well trained analytically. And it's something that we are trying to convey much more explicitly, that really the thing that's happening just emerging out of the training are these analytical skills, which are, if you have a problem presented to you, how to solve that problem. And that solution is something that our graduates, I think, can uniquely do compared to some other professions. They can recognize the problem. They can figure out how to get information that is going to play into how they might try and solve that problem. And they'll put in place mechanisms to really affect those solutions. And then the key thing is that they'll be able to recognize whether or not they did a good job solving it. So they'll go back and rigorously say, okay, well, we did this, now we can move on. Or we didn't do this because something wasn't controlled well, we got to do something else. So they can generally do that, but it takes quite a while for them to recognize that that's a plus. And I don't know how effectively that happens. And so that's a challenge, because that has a bearing on folks recognizing what kinds of careers they might really choose to go into, because it does not have to be the thing that I do, right? It doesn't have to be doing research kind of thing. It could be something very much as important, more important, differently fulfilling than the standard thing coming in. So those are challenges that we have, and we don't have mechanisms in place to do well by our students to convey all that, but that's what we're actively talking about in the BGS administration, like how to convey those things. So that's what I can say about that.
That's Steve, that's just so powerful. I mean, and again, we're still moving in this continued thread of purposeful discernment. So no matter what level, a student is in, it's how are you recognizing the gifts and talents that are connected to their discipline, but also transcend the discipline, to be able to apply those skills based on their definition, going back to our first question, their definition or evolving definitions of success, right? So really offering that broadened scope. As we continue this conversation with a lens towards our graduate students, my next question, Meredith Wooten, is for you. What are some distinct challenges that graduate students in the humanities and social sciences may face in terms of their career pursuits and aspirations?
Thank you. So I'm Meredith Wooten. I'm the director of the Graduate Student Center, which is where I am today. And I'm actually really thankful to Steve for your comments. One of the things, the bio that was made available to folks for today is pulled from our website. And one of the things about my bio on the website is that it emphasizes all the things that I did in graduate school that were not my research, which I don't think that my advisors were really thrilled with, me being very involved at the Graduate Student Center and in student government and doing all of these other sorts of things while I was pursuing my degree. But one of the things that I realized along the way was that I really enjoyed program development. I enjoyed working directly with students and sort of solving problems in a much more concrete, short-term way. And I'm really thankful for those experiences, because they prepared me to come back and do this sort of in this role professionally. But some of that discernment, I actually think that BGS does a really great job of, to the extent that you've incorporated things like individual development plans into part of the academic training for students. Individual development plans, IDPs, are much more common in STEM fields. It's a big difference between STEM and humanities and social sciences, as part of annual reviews or just as part of the training of students. And that's, right now in many graduate groups in the humanities and social sciences at Penn and elsewhere at our peer institutions, students who seek out career services, or students who are seeking to sort of explore alternative career paths, might discover all of the resources that are available to them at Penn in terms of, like, I'm going to get this right, Imagine PhD, or there's My Chem IDP and some other, there are these different tools, but they're largely not required or even encouraged by the programs themselves, right? So what we still have in most of the humanities and social sciences is an apprenticeship model of advising that is also a sort of proprietary model of advising, right? There is a mentor or an advisor and their student, right? And there's the language of ownership there and everything, right? It's my student. And that model works if a student is going to become just like the mentor, right? So the faculty person often has only ever held that type of position, and they're only really qualified to train a student to become like them. We can't expect much more from our faculty than who don't have additional training in career development, professional development for their students. So one of the key things that I think needs to change and that we can facilitate is really early on getting our students and hopefully our faculty to accept models of advising and mentorship that are more collaborative, right? So having students recognize early on, the value in seeking out multiple mentors, even if they are sort of set on a tenure track academic career, right? That there's value in that anyway, that in a STEM field, you might be in a team environment because you're in a lab or otherwise doing collaborative work, and that's just not the case in these fields. I think the other thing, in STEM fields, it's just much more common to accept, successful career outcomes are any in which the student is doing research at least, right? So industry, government, or academia, right? Like those are the three acceptable paths. And in the humanities and social sciences, really, it's often still just the one. And that sets students and departments and programs up for failure, right? So if you have 50% of your students getting tenure track jobs, that's terrific. I mean, nationally, if that's that's terrific. But to the student who doesn't get one of those positions or to the program, that feels like failure. So, we need to change our metrics of success. We need to really look at our advising models. And then I think I have much more I could say about this, but, I think that as we change those metrics, we could all do a better job of keeping in touch with our alumni who leave academia, right? So it's very common to have colloquia speakers, have folks come back who have a new book out or, whatever, bring them back to the department. And, even though the programs that are doing things fairly well might have one panel a year on all AC positions or one panel a year with alumni who are not in faculty positions. And, again, we have so many PhD alumni who did not follow those paths. And if we just maintain those ties and connections and consider those students and alums to be parts of our network, it's as simple as bringing them back to help mentor our students to offset the gaps in our own expertise. So again, I said that there's a lot more that I could say there, but I'll stop and I'll look in the chat. I'm happy to answer more questions.
Thank you. And you continue to evoke the reminder that across all of our populations, really creating space for that exploration, right? The agency of our students to be able to explore through, in your case, you talked about, a multiple mentorship model or advising pods in some way where, we're exposed to different ways that our students have applied their degrees in their life beyond their programs for sure. So it's really rich guidance for all of us. As we continue to think about career development for our students, Barb, my next question is for you. So Barbara Hewitt, I would love to hear from you, as you continue to steward our career services area, what are some of the recent shifts and changes that we've seen occurring, particularly for career development with undergraduate students?
Great, thank you for that question, Mom. I'm super delighted to be here. I am Barbara Hewitt. I'm the Executive Director of the Career Services Office here at Penn. We serve all of the undergraduates and undergraduate alumni, plus lots of the graduate students, but not all of them. So anyway, I was reflecting on this session today and somehow I find that I've been in this field for like over 30 years, which is mind-boggling to me. But I was thinking back to, I worked for 5 years at Dickinson College in the Career Center before I came to Penn. And it also happens to be my alma mater. I'm very fond of Dickinson and got a great education there. But I remember in working at the Career Center, we would sort of joke amongst ourselves about how soon right after the graduation ceremony would the first seniors come in who had just graduated that had never been in our office. And usually it was about 1 o'clock because students would go to the ceremony, then they would go have lunch with their parents, and then they would wander into the Career Center because their parents made them because they were worried about a job. Even when I came to Penn, and that's been over 20 years now, there was this feeling that we should be extremely hands-off with freshmen because they were here to explore their academics and figure out who they were, meet their roommate. I think all of that is super important. I do think the academics and getting grounded as a student and making friends and joining clubs, all of those things are important when you're a freshman. But the times have really changed a lot. And I think the day of saying to students, don't worry about any of this stuff until at least junior year, when you need to get that junior year internship, it's fine. Do whatever you want to do before that. Don't even worry about this. Those days are long gone. Because employers want people with some experience who have thought about what they want to do with their lives, who can go into an interview and talk about the things that they've done that have prepared them for the opportunities that they're interviewing for. So those things definitely fall in academics. They could be senior thesis, they could be research projects, they could do work with a research with a professor on campus, they could be leadership activities. But clearly many employers are looking for work experience and internships as well, where you've gotten some actual practical experience working in the industry that you want to go into. So I think that one of the biggest changes I've seen of just, it is really imperative to us to dialogue with students about what they want to do. Not, careers are evolving. They are always changing. Not that people have to have an answer from freshman year and it doesn't change to senior year, but to start thinking about it. And lots of times we work with students who get an internship maybe sophomore year, find that they don't like the field or they want to shift a little bit, reprogram. That is all really healthy, but they're figuring that stuff out while they're in college so that when they start after college, they have a better idea of where they might fit. So I would say just thinking about things earlier and getting that experience earlier is really important. We see students who are seniors who don't have that experience really struggling with the job search after they graduate. We've found typically in the past few years, about a third of the students, their full-time job, they have interned with that employer. So it's definitely a pipeline into many fields, particularly like finance or consulting, technology. There are certain fields where that is basically the easiest way to get in. Other fields like entertainment, nonprofit, they are not such structured pipelines, but still they're going to want to see that you have that experience. The other thing I would say, and this is a good thing for our society, it makes it a little harder for Penn, but there's been a real shift and focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion, which I think is great for our society. When I came to Penn, again, over 20 years ago, I could not believe how employers were just beating the doors down to recruit our students. And we do have great talent, but as Mark had mentioned it, we had that credential signaling going on, that if you recruited from Penn or Princeton or Harvard, you're going to get really amazing students, which was true, but it was leaving out all those really amazing students at state schools or community colleges or smaller liberal arts schools like Dickinson, where I went. And some of that credential signaling, I think employers are looking at it and saying, wow, we are just not giving equal opportunity to everybody. They can't even get their foot in the door. So we are finding that many employers who used to spend a lot of time on Penn's campus, like every week, doing coffee chats and doing information sessions and coming to the recruiting suite, they're stepping back from that and looking more holistically, maybe not spending so much time on individual campuses, but trying to recruit students from all over. In fact, our handshake platform, that is why it got started. They wanted to democratize opportunity because the founder of it came from this little school up in the upper Michigan and nobody ever went there to recruit. So that propelled him to move forward and create a tool that students from any school could really get some visibility on. So that is a really great thing, I think, for our society. And I think it's really true, but it does change the way we interact with employers because many of them are just not spending so much time on Penn's campus. That being said, we have amazing students, and I think they will find their ways to the paths they want to make. Our outcomes are great. It's just how they're getting to those particular outcomes are different than they probably were 10 years ago, for sure. And then the last thing I'd want to say is just the whole idea of sort of testing your skills. You used to be able to say you had a skill or you did something, and there wasn't really great ways of proving it. But now lots of employers are doing online assessments, things like Pymetrics, which is a sort of gamification system that you go in based on neuroscience. They will ask students to do things like that, or maybe do a coding challenge, and they will actually see, can you do whatever it is you say you can do? Again, that's a really good democratization tool, because I think it doesn't matter where you went. If you can do the particular skill, the employer is going to take another look at you and then probably move you into an interview process. So this idea of continuing to upgrade skills and to do that throughout your life is going to be really important. Things change so rapidly. You can't just rely on a degree that you maybe got 10 years ago. You have to keep those skills and knowledge fresh. So I will leave it there, but certainly we could talk for hours on this.
Thank you so much. You shared so much. As I think about the holistic conversation that all of you have co-created with your wisdom, I have curiosity around, you read the studies, AAC&U continually releases these reports of how employers are perceiving recent college graduates and their abilities. And all of you mentioned it in some way. Rudy was the first to bring up the specific language of soft skills. So I'm going to lift that up a little bit. And it's in my observation, and I sit further away from the direct practice of supporting students. We notice that our students have skills and they have a set of experiences, but there's often a gap in their ability to meaning make and connect those experiences. How can we better work with and I think this is consistent across all levels of students. How can we be better as mentors to students? If we work with students in programmatic spaces, in what ways can we be better partners alongside you in helping students connect those skills that they are developing as a result of the experiences they've had? Yeah, Mark.
Well, one of my favorite research projects that I share across a number of contexts, it's now based at, I think it's Wellesley or Wesleyan. It's one of the W's in Massachusetts, led by Marianne Winklemess, originally from UNLV. And her research focuses on the importance of transparency in learning and teaching. And to that, I would add advising. And it's not transparency in terms of, just making everything clear to students. It's also helping students to connect the dots between the purpose of the conversation or the task that you're asking them to accomplish, how it reinforces certain skills, and how those skills will connect to their career aspirations, to their personal values and or community goals in ways that are explicit and very well applied. And I think that sort of transparency helps students to shift through the noise of why am I doing this?
Thank you, Mark. Any other adds and reflections around this question? And folks, as folks are answering questions, please feel free to ask your own questions in the chat.
I would just say that is probably our core job in career services, help students translate what they've done in college, because let's face it, sometimes the stuff you're studying in college, that paper you wrote on, some small aspect of the French Revolution may seem completely irrelevant to what you're interviewing for. And, my staff is really good in helping students make those connections, the critical thinking. I have a list here of the skills employers want, and they are things like the top one: critical thinking, problem solving, teamwork, collaboration, professionalism, work ethic, written and oral communications. Those are things all of our students have, but they aren't always so good at expressing it and making those connections. So just a shout out to my team. I know we work a lot on that, and I think it's super important.
Thank you. Yes, Meredith.
I mean, I would echo that. I would also lift up the work that CURF does, particularly around fellowships. And I don't know, I just saw Jane pop up in the window, so maybe she was, I will let you say some of this too. But, you know, I think that for students at the undergraduate or graduate level, when they see success or they see someone who is in, you know, if you take Tamara, right, like you see someone in a position and they're able to give you a narrative of how they got there. And there's an assumption in many cases that that was an intentionally pursued path, and one that the student was, you know, someone was always passionate about and only passionate about, right? That there weren't alternative paths that could have been pursued. And I think that if we can, you know, identify that uncertainty that we've all experienced, identify failure, right? Sort of, these are paths that I took that didn't work out, but here's what I got out of them. And here's how skills that I got there translated over into this new path. You know, I think the more that we can talk about all of the sort of unintentional and coincidental and sort of other kind of messy bits of getting to whatever the career outcome is, the more our students are maybe tolerant even of the conversations that are needed for them to make those, you know, make those connections, right? Because you have to do a good degree of self-examination, right? And that's uncomfortable, right? Admitting that you're uncertain, admitting that you don't know, or that you're not sure why you care about something or how you care about it. And that's sort of where I started my comments, was talking about the work that CURF is doing. You know, I think when students are applying for fellowships or really kind of doing personal statements of any sort, that's what that work is. And I think Career Services is doing a lot of that work too. It's just so important for students to take time to reflect in a structured way with some help. You know, for graduate students, I think the earlier that they can start applying for funding, the better, because it forces them to explain their research and it forces them to sort of articulate themselves. And I can't speak to what undergraduates should be doing, but maybe Jane can. I can see her hands up.
Yeah, I would love to hear from Jane and Meredith. As you were talking, my brain went to the social justice lens, and I was thinking, what would the world be if Gandhi just continued to be a failed attorney, right? Right, and yet he leveraged those skills to do something far greater than his practice. But if we talked about kind of those failures in a way that you reference more, like what is left to be imagined, I just think that possibility is so inspiring. Jane, yes.
Yeah, so kind of think we should like reframe the whole concept around failure kind of dramatically, because it's learning and it's growing. But yes, so Meredith is absolutely correct. I mean, the very foundation of what we do in CURF, whether it's with undergraduate research or fellowships, is all about the value of that process, the process of active self-reflection, whereby, you know, you kind of look at what your goals are and kind of look at where you've been and kind of making the right choices to help get you towards those goals. And yes, active self-reflection. It's it is a buzzword in our field, and but it's actually very real. And even in all that we do, so from undergraduate research through to fellowships, what we're asking our students to do is to kind of do all those, you know, develop all those critical thinking skills and learn how to talk about what's important to them, you know, and convince other people. They have to convince themselves first, but then they convince other people that this is worthy of funding and moving forward. So it's an honor to be able to do that kind of work with our students, and it prepares them, you know, even if they never win a fellowship, and if they are, you know, they go do research on bird songs and end up working on Wall Street, it's all connected. And so that's what we are all about, is really helping make those connections for them.
Thank you, Jane. That might be my quote for a long amount of time: research on bird songs and working on Wall Street. Thank you. Rudy, I think you also had something to reflect on.
Thanks, Mamta. I mentioned the soft skills because this is what I struggled with when I came to the United States 35 years ago. You know, I don't know what soft skills are. I thought my resume will speak for itself. But our international students are struggling with this because there's so many layers that they have to pass through. You know, when I first came to the United States, we thought putting a picture with the resume will make my resume more competitive. I said, wow, I have a nice picture, so I have to go to, you know, the photo center, and people tell, no, you don't put pictures here in the United States, and because it's another layer of complexity here that you're adding. And so for a lot of people, you're willing to self-reflect and be able to talk about your credentials and be proud of it. It's a challenge. It's a soft skills that when you interview, our international students are now willing to, am I bragging? Am I boasting too much? Will I be hired because I'm boasting too much? I think it's a difference between boasting and selling your credentials, marketing your credentials. And I think that's the biggest challenge. And as university administrators, I think we need to engage and empower our students for us to be able to listen to them, because they're navigating so many complex layers of intercultural differences here. They don't know how to be marketable without thinking that they might be too aggressive. They don't know the meaning of aggressive and assertiveness. So many layers here that can turn off people because they can overdo it. I have learned, don't shake hands too fast or too hard, that you can break the knuckles of the other person shaking. When I was interviewing for when I was a young international grad student, this employer shook hands very firm, and I said, ouch. And my initial reaction was that, ooh, did I lose the job because of that? Did I lose my opportunity because I said, ouch? So little things like that, for me, those are things that we don't realize is creating a layer of barriers already for internationals. So for colleagues out there, and for my colleagues here in the virtual platform here, our international students, sometimes what we think is simple is not simple for them. It's complicated.
Yeah.
What we think is common sense is not common sense for some of them. It's more of, oh, I didn't know that. So I just want to put it out there. And thank you, Mamta, for always talking about social justice, because these are layers of social justice that we don't realize. We thought it's safe and this is harmless, but it's actually can create more issues for us. So.
Well, and Rudy, what you talk about, you know, it's not hard for them, it's different, right? So our students come with wisdom from their lived experiences. They're operating in a different context. You know, and as we even prepare students who are raised in the United States to have successful careers in other countries, we would expect them to also engage in a level of discernment and understand the cultural frame, right? So like the way that I was raised here, I remember when I would visit my family in India, it's like, oh, too aggressive. Why are you looking people in the eye? Like, what's wrong with, you know? So we have to be able to learn different manifestations. I don't like the term code switching, but I'm just going to use that because I think we're conventionally familiar with that term, but we have to learn to assess the environment and adjust accordingly, right? This question, it just compels me to ask the question, Mark, I hope I'm not catching you off guard. I'll lead with you on this question and open it, because I think all of you have wisdom around this question, which is, how do we, in our career discernment partnerships with our students, how do we work with our students for them to recognize the wisdom that comes from their lived experiences, right? And so I think about when we talk about our first-gen low-income students, how do we reframe our own practice so that we are not unintentionally operating from a deficit mindset, and that we're recognizing the core levels of wisdom that they bring to the table, and knowing how to navigate with a phenomenal level of excellence and leverage those strengths in the meaning making.
Thanks, Mamta. I'm gonna offer a term that hopes to move us past the notion of code switching. There's a body of scholarship called communication accommodation theory, and it's essentially a nerdier way of talking about this in the way that doesn't force folks to dichotomize their identities. And I want to start off there by acknowledging that there's a skill set inherent to being the first person to navigate a bureaucracy that our first generation students possess. I'm not going to call it grit or resilience. I want to honor and celebrate Angela Duckworth and her brilliance And at the same time, I also want to recognize that it shouldn't take grit and resilience for students to navigate higher education or career pathways. And so it's possible to do both, right? I think I just did that. And also at the same time acknowledge that there are certain skills as it relates to navigating capitalism that we all possess, and it takes a certain additional level of creativity on the behalf of those of us who come from more modestly resourced backgrounds in order to navigate as well. That sometimes also ties into bureaucracy too, when we think about federal programs. And so when we think about what it takes for our students to make it to Penn, when they don't necessarily have some of the advantages, and these are structural issues, it's nothing wrong with them, absolutely not. It's them navigating structures that weren't designed for them. That sort of intellect, that sort of way of thinking has value and translates into thinking about how they operationalize things in the workplace, how they conceive of processes and procedures in their field or in their discipline. And so there are all these ways to translate that skill set in ways that uplift the strengths that they have, and recognize that there are ways to grow those into different fields at the same time. So
I suspect that more of y'all have reflections on this. I want to open.
I just want to say, we as a higher ed entity all are guilty of making it so daggone complex when it really doesn't need to be. And I don't know why we continue to take some sort of pleasure in making it more and more complex and more of a roadblock. And I always liken it to, I work in higher ed, and when I'm trying to navigate for my own children, it can be daunting. And I'm like, I think I'm supposed to know this stuff. And I then reflect on, what do students do who don't have that support at home? Maybe they're not in the best resourced high schools, right? So as Mark says, the ability to get to Penn from that vantage point is a skill set that we need to be figuring out how to translate that into work skills, because it is daunting. The other thing that I think is important, I will say, I am in no way pretending that the world is perfect. We know the world is not perfect. Today is a reminder that the world is not perfect. However, am I freezing? Okay, it's on my screen as though I'm freezing. However, I also think that more employers are more understanding that diversity in terms of background and what people bring to the table is more celebrated than it was 30 years ago or 20 years ago. So I do think that students with coaching and mentorship are able to say, yes, I'm different, but that's not a negative. And that's where I try to work with students. You do have value. What can you bring to the table? What do you want to highlight about your personal self that makes you different and competitive for the job? So I think that's important that we acknowledge changing in a positive way.
Absolutely. Any other, as we continue, I want to, I think about, when we think about first gen and low income populations, again, something that I know I want to continue to do my own work on is making sure that I think about that at the undergraduate level, but I think about that at the graduate level too, right? And so if you are now a first gen student for the first time navigating a PhD program, and there are ways of exploration that I mean, if you leveraged, the cultural wealth and wisdom to navigate the undergrad experience, those skills are still with you, and graduate experiences is yet another world. my colleagues, well, across the board, I work with and support graduate students. Any insight on how we can be mindful and present to navigating and supporting first-gen graduate and professional students through their career discernment?
So I would say, I think that this links up with the conversations that we're having about the hidden curriculum sort of more broadly, and just making it visible, right? Sort of talking about all of these things that we are assuming folks know about how the university works, how their fields work, you know, how research works. But, you know, I also think it's sort of, it's connected to the shift that Steve was talking about in the sort of when students get here, the ways that they are expected to think and act and conduct research. For many first generation college students, and for some students who are coming from non-US backgrounds, right? They're very bright, they are very driven, and the way that they got through undergraduate, you know, their undergraduate education was that, right? Sort of, they did not necessarily have extracurriculars. They just worked very hard and they figured out how to do things on their own, and they were praised for that, right? Sort of, they did all of this stuff on their own through resilience and grit, and sort of when you get to graduate school, you know, you have to be willing to say that you need help. You have to actively seek help. You have to collaborate with others. You have to sort of be willing to ask stupid questions in seminars, right? There are all of these habits that are not correlated with success as an undergraduate, that we expect students to just feel comfortable with. And I think for many first-gen students, that level of comfort of just saying, like, I need help with this, or I don't know this, right? If you're not sure what things you're not supposed to not know, right? It's sort of, I don't know which things are okay for me to admit I don't know, or which things I'm expected to know. And so they can drown, right? You know, so I think the more that we can have conversations that are extremely transparent upfront, and really have conversations with faculty about assumptions that we're making, about where a student is coming from, what obligations they have, sort of what their priorities might be, what their values might be, right? I think the better. And I don't know if Steve, you want to, I just spoke on your behalf, so.
I mean, I could add just a simple thing, which is, if you put on top of the insecurity of saying, I don't know something, the whole power dynamic thing that all the students feel relative to us, you know, I can only imagine. And I was a graduate student, but, and my parents did not go to college, but that was so long ago that, one, I can barely remember, and two, I don't want to say my experiences are relevant to this at all. So I feel like I'm an old white guy who really has, you know, the communities that I'm serving are completely different than I am and was and are, and that's all good. So I can't imagine needing to acknowledge that you don't know something, because, as I said before, research is about that. It's about what we don't know. And that's a hard thing to convey to everybody coming in, I think. And then this whole thing about admitting it to someone who you're, I guess, you know, realistically you shouldn't, but you really do think knows everything, right? It's just, I can only imagine how tough it really is. Ugh. So, yeah. I think one other thing I was going to say is, one thing is to trust and use the student. So a lot that has happened in biomedical graduate studies, and I'm sure is happening in your individual communities too, is there's quite a lot of student peer group organization, of course, especially over the last year and a half, but even preceding that, in terms of supporting first-gen students coming in, or in terms of just peer advising to, you know, figure out how to get through the program. And some of that is probably what faculty to avoid or go to or something, but some of it is much more subtle than that, and much more coming from their own experiences than that. And I think the more we support peer group networks within the communities that we serve, I'm sure that's having a positive impact, but, you know, I can't say more than that, since I'm not part of that peer group network.
Yeah, no, it's really powerful, Steve. There's a question in the chat. Joseph asked the question, do you have a sense of how faculty as a whole think about career success for students and postdocs?
Thanks, Joe. I mean, I can't, so there was I don't forgot, 600 to 700 students, and there's X number of faculty in the program. So you know, speaking for faculty is just like speaking for any individual student. The faculty run the gamut. Some are incredibly attuned to the things that we're all talking about. Some are too busy to be incredibly attuned. I won't say that they're not interested in them. Some probably are not that interested in them or feel like we coddle our students too much. There's a gamut of what's run. By and large, my experience has been the faculty are in the right place. And if there's things that don't happen, it's oversight and just overwork and over everything. But I kind of edge toward the side of forgivingness, so that maybe that's why I feel that way. So I don't have a good answer for your question, Joe. Like the students, the best answer is that the students certainly feel, there certainly is a cadre of students who feel that going to faculty and saying, I'm not really interested in doing precisely what you do, I want to try to explore this, which other folks have talked about. That's a hard thing for a number of students to do, to go to their mentors, to their faculty thesis committee, to their immediate supervisors and say, even if they, you know, ideally would say, like, I totally respect the work you're doing, it's phenomenal, and running this lab is incredible, but what I see for myself is, I want time to explore, right? What Meredith said in her CV, I guess, right? You want time to explore these other things because you're really getting the right kind of feedback from them and seeing what your strengths really could be. It's hard for our students, I don't want to say always, but at some reasonable frequency, it's hard for our students to do that. And we that talk about this, of course, it's not hard for us to hear that. We're happy to hear that, but I think our students don't see it that way. And I don't know how to fix that problem. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I would love to hear if there are questions in the chat. Folks want to post questions in the chat for us to be able to answer questions that are captivating your heart and soul right now. All right, so we have a question in the chat from Rachel. Are there ways that we as staff can help fill that gap that Steve described between student and faculty? It's a good question.
I would say a very simple thing that I think is helpful to students kind of universally is for people to tell and talk openly about their failures. And we said that earlier, but when a student looks at us in whatever role or title we have, they imagine incorrectly that none of us have stumbled, none of us have failed, and certainly that none of us didn't know what it is we wanted to do with the rest of our lives at 20 years old. So I think sometimes openly talking about things that we grappled with and letting that become more of the norm would be beneficial to our students at all different levels. And I just think we don't do enough of that. Therefore, when I meet a student and they see your title, they're automatically intimidated, the barriers go up, versus looking at me as a human, which is how I always want them to view me, as a human who's made a lot of mistakes along the way. And luckily I had a soft landing when I made those mistakes and was able to get back up and turn those into learning opportunities. But we just, I feel like at a college, at the collegiate level, we just don't talk about our failures. I don't have, that I can remember, one faculty member who ever acknowledged that they failed somehow. I've heard administrators, but we need to get into the habit of talking to students about that. And I also talk about that in the way of mental health for our students, because there's the perfectionism that's going on. And if they just knew everyone around them wasn't perfect, they might feel more comfortable approaching us. Meredith has her hand up, so I'm going to be quiet and let her talk.
No, I think that's right. And I think that, you know, the complement to it is also celebrating other forms of success, right? So, you know, I think that I often actually experience the opposite, which is students who are in their final year of a PhD and are worried about the job market will come and say, oh, or I'll just get a job in academic administration, right? As though no preparation is needed to do that. Obviously, your job doesn't involve any skills. It's what you do when you fail. So, you know, so there is this weird like bifurcation in how students are thinking about alternative paths. We need to recognize failure and maybe encourage some intentionality. But I think that the complement to this, and I said this a little bit earlier in talking about, you know, reaching out to alumni who go into non-academic fields or, you know, or just do other things, right? Is we often will get newsletters from a department chair or program chair or, you know, from a dean or whatever that celebrates certain forms of success, right? So this many students placed, and we know what that means, right? So these many students are placed in tenure track jobs, this many students got grants, right? This student published a new book, et cetera, right? All academic markers of success. And I think that we as staff can identify our alumni who are doing amazing things that are not those things and celebrate them alongside, right? Just to lift up, right? There are other paths available to you. And also, by the way, you could probably reach out to that alum and ask them how they got there, right? And, you know, I think that you can do that without insulting anybody about, you know, about their abilities too. I think that there's a little bit of anxiety, not anxiety, maybe that, you know, some faculty, I certainly can't speak on behalf of the faculty, but some, you know, really do recognize that there's a job crisis and also that they're limited in their ability to advise students, right? So they really do need staff to help figure out how we're going to support our students. You know, so I think that we can have these conversations and try to complement that work without telling anyone that they're not doing their, you know, right? Or without expecting folks to do things they weren't trained to do.
Yes, it was Barb and then Rudy.
I had two thoughts around this. One is just you know, when I was doing more career advising, I would hear the same names of faculty members come up a lot of people who really made a difference. I mean, Adam Grant is one of those. I've never met Adam Grant, but I get emails from him when he has a job that he has. He's amazing at connecting with people, and I hear students who work with him. He's been super helpful. So I think faculty can absolutely make a difference. But I also think that we hear with students going on to graduate and professional school that sometimes they don't know who to ask for a reference letter because they didn't know they were supposed to, or try to develop those relationships and maybe go to office hours and do some work on their own to do that outreach to signal to a faculty member that they wanted a little bit of a closer relationship. So I think it's incumbent on us to normalize that behavior as well, just as much that the students have a part in developing these relationships along with the faculty members.
Rudy.
Yes, I think we have a very pivotal role in, you know, creating the bridge between us and the faculty. In the practical ways, for example, when we do Global Forerunner, I always create faculty panel so that they see the faculty as human beings, not in the ivory towers, and asking faculty tough questions like, how can you be engaged with our students? How are you providing that venue for students to be engaged with you? I think when the student, because our international students, there's a power distance. When they see Dr. Akapadi, that's Dr. Akapadi. It's hard for them to connect with Dr. Akapadi because you're not providing the platform for them to be able to know her. I think that's important for us. Number two, also though, is I encounter students coming to my office because faculty are holding them in their terms hostage, that they don't want to graduate, they don't want them to finish their dissertation, they don't want to seek jobs yet because they have to finish research here in the university, and they don't know how to navigate that. And as staff, we have to give them that avenue for listening, but give them coaching and providing with the resource of because they're scared of the repercussions if they open up, if they get more resources to, and because they think that they're talking about their faculty. And I think how that's for me is the harder one. When students come to me and asking for advice because the faculty is not giving them the opportunity to fly free and spread their wings because their research is more important and they're holding them to that responsibility. So that's a tough one for me, but for me, I think the best way we can do is listen, provide some advice, coach them, but give them the reality check. That sometimes that's a challenge. So
thank you. Colleagues, panelists, there's another question in the chat. I think, again, would anyone please share your reflections. How can we acknowledge the parental or familial pressure for certain types of career success in students? As somebody who disappointed her parents by not becoming a medical doctor, I too am interested in this question because I'm still healing from it. So
I can speak on that, Mamta. My dad expected me to be a doctor since I was 1 year old. And so for me, that was very hard for me to navigate. And I think for us, we have to make sure that when we coach our students, we have to be self-aware, but also understand where that person is coming from. It's not an easy, well, you have the right, of course, you're an adult, you're 25 years old, go for what your dreaming is. Don't be a doctor. If you don't want to be a doctor, tell your mom and dad not to be a doctor. I think it's easier said than done. And I think it's an opportunity for you to be able to help that student navigate that conversation with the father or the mother. For me, I was able to do that alone. It was very difficult because all the coaching that I received from colleagues here in the United States is coming from a very Western perspective, that you have the right, you are free now, you're here in the United States. Of course, tell mom and dad, you no longer live under the roof. It's easier said than done. Make sure that you understand where they're coming from, but give them the opportunity to express and be honest with mom and dad and share to them that mom and dad, I love you, I care for you, but I think if I continue to be a medical doctor, I think I will fail. It's hurting me now, it's failing me now, I'm not good in math, I'm not good in the sciences, and I think I would be more successful going into this field rather than the medical. I think those very difficult conversations with the heart would be very critical. I think what will now work for me before is when said, you are already here in America, feel free to tell your mom and dad that you don't want that route, you will rather go this route. That's very, very difficult for our students. It's not an easy thing for them to do. But that's a very good question, Mamta. I'm glad you asked that because that's not only for internationals, even for our domestic students. So
I'm chuckling because I remember when my advisor literally said that exact same thing to me. You're in America, and I want to be like, I want you to tell that to my mother and see what her reaction is going to be as she raises her hand. Like, so yeah. I mean, and I think thinking about that the question may be a simple one, like I don't want to do this, but the resolution of that tension is different for different identities. So that I don't want the whole notion of I don't want to be a ... engineer, doctor, accountant, whatever that pathway may be, could launch into a true mental health crisis for a student because of the depth of like, okay, if I'm coming from a collectivist background, now you're putting me at tension with generations of family hopes and dreams, right? So then that's not a career question anymore. It's a family, so it becomes so much deeper. It's not just that singular question. So we have the responsibility to discern the depth of that question for that student because it may be different. But Barb, let's go to you.
Yeah, when I work in a situation with that student, usually, the parent just wants the student to succeed. That is what the issue is. It's because they love their kid. It's not because they're trying to be jerks or ruin their life. So what I try to do is help the student figure out what other path might be right for them, and then help them find the data of how to show that could be successful. So if the concern is philosophy majors don't get jobs, I can show them that philosophy majors do get jobs. This is what they do. These are the skills you have. Here are some alumni that you can talk to who've done wonderful things with philosophy majors. but to try to help them have that conversation with some real answers for parents instead of just leaving them with all the questions they might have.
Wonderful. Any questions from our participants? You can put it in the chat. I may have us wrap up our, and I'll ask a final question. Just any piece of advice that you would, I mean, you know, these have been questions that have been decided for you. So I want you all to be able to share your wisdom for the question that you wish somebody had asked you and answer that. And then I also see a question in the chat. So we'll kind of do a both and as we wrap this conversation up. So it's a very good question. Emily asks, I find a lot of students feel overwhelmed by the amount of options out there. Are there any strategies or best practice you can use to help students navigate exploration and uncertainty? So let's kind of reflect on that question and any advice that you would offer us, and then we'll close.
I can do the offer advice and then trying to narrow it down. So the advice that I give very concretely to students and to parents or guardians is there is never one linear path to whatever it is you want to achieve. And even in the discipline of becoming a doctor, I have stories of people who did not do well in undergrad, then did not get into medical school, who then did post-bac graduate courses somewhere else, strengthened their academic resumes, and then 3 or 4 years later applied to medical school, got in, and are now successful practicing doctors. People don't ever tell that side of there's more than one path to get to your goal. And we just don't talk about it enough. And I always, when I was doing academic advising years ago, I would say to students, your path is your path. Don't measure yourself by someone else's path. We're all different. And as long as you achieve for yourself your success, what you are happy with, that's kind of the best that you can ask for you to be healthy, to be mentally healthy, to be successful in your eyes. And that is just so important that we try to box our students in. You got 4 years to finish the undergraduate degree. You got 2 years to do the master's degree. You got 4 or 5 years to do the PhD or whatever else you're going to do. And I'm like, that's not everyone's path. Let's not make that everyone's path. So that's my advice there. And then in terms of strategies of narrowing things down, while I agree with narrowing it down for the purpose of focusing, I also want us to say to our students, it's okay to pivot. If you start going down a path and then you decide that this is not what you want to do, I'm a prime example of that. I went to law school not to practice law, which I knew, but they prepare you to practice law. So I did what everybody else was doing, applying for jobs at law firms. And my second summer, which is pretty typical, you get your job and that job is supposed to land you into your graduation job. Well, I go to a humongous firm in Philadelphia and I'm miserable for 10 summer weeks in Philadelphia. I had a blast being in Philadelphia, but I hated the work. And what it did was it solidified for me, I don't want to work in a huge, large corporate firm. So even though that was a tough experience, it really solidified for me that even the law is not this straight path that you come out of a top 10 law school, you got to go to the largest law firm, the one paying the most money in order to be successful. So that's where I kind of get that framework from. And then I never worked at a firm with more than 15 attorneys. And that firm that I worked for that summer had 350 attorneys. in 1987.
I would just repeat what I said earlier for PhD students is the more that they can use the tools that are available to them through the Career Services graduate student page, right, to really identify not necessarily the exact path or job, but what are the skills that you have? What are your strengths? What are your values? What are your interests? Right? Because that, I said with myself, I knew that I liked program development. Now, whether I was going to do that in this role or a different role or a nonprofit or, it didn't really matter. I knew the kinds of work that I wanted to be doing and that I was good at, right? And so then sort of those tools both help you understand that about yourself, but then also see, well, here are the different kinds of careers in which I can apply those things and not have to have an uncomfortable conversation with your advisor. The other thing, I would, again, just echo the importance of talking about failures. My favorite example is Stacey Abrams, right? Failed to get the roads. I'm glad she did. Failed to become governor, and I'm glad she did, right? For me personally, right? I think she talks a lot and openly about pulling lessons from those failures, but also sort of what was driving her wasn't necessarily that particular end. Right? What was driving her was something bigger, and that was just that particular manifestation of that end. So when that particular manifestation didn't work out, that's okay. Here's this other way that I can do the same kinds of work. And I think if we can, have those conversations with our students, then they're also just more likely to take risks. For graduates, that's a harder conversation, but for undergraduates, right? So you didn't get that particular job. It's not as big of a deal if you understand that the things that you're looking for transcend individual job titles and roles.
If I may add, I think Emily's question is also open to for our international students. They will take it as there's not a lot of options out there for them. However, even though the question is so different, it's the opposite. The advice that were provided by Tamara and Meredith can also apply. That there's not a lot of options for me out there, but for us, let's help them navigate that. Okay, there's no option here, but how about overseas? How about this? How about that? How about going this route? Because for our international students, they feel very rejected and very down because for them, they don't think there's a lot of opportunities out there. But again, there's a lot of hope out there. There's a lot of opportunities out there. It's how we talk to them about it. It's how we coach them. It's building a light at the end of the tunnel perspective for them. If I encourage my colleagues who are also attending this virtual session, instead of saying, well, you're right, there's not a lot of opportunities. So I just want to share it out there. That's the same advice.
Well, time flies when we're having fun. And so here we are to the end of our panel conversation. Colleagues, I really want to thank you for mentoring me. And I just learned so much from all of you and from Mark, who had to step away. So thank you for your candor, your care, your compassion and commitment to our students overall. It's just great to be in learning community with all of you today. Thank you so much for attending.